In this video, we're going to take a look at the legislatures of the republics across the world, as well as their functions and partisan makeup. The author gives us the duties of legislatures right here. They represent the people. Compared to the executive branch as well as the courts, they tend to be the most representative when it comes to people. Legislatures are closely related to the people. The deliberative branch, they are the ones that think, that revise, that edit, that revisit ideas. Legislative, obviously, because they make law. That is the definition of legislating, making law. And supervision. They provide oversight and supervise the actions of the executive branch as well as executive agencies. In some cases, legislatures also might supervise the court system. We can categorize legislatures into two categories, unicameral and bicameral. Take the United States of America. We have a bicameral legislature. Americans didn't always have that. The initial independent American Republic had but one chamber, and that was a Continental Congress. The framers of the United States Constitution wanted a Congress that was more powerful, but to prevent too much power being in this new legislative branch, they decided to check the power by creating a lower chamber of Congress, that is the House of Representatives, and an upper chamber of Congress, that is known today as the Senate. Other republics did not necessarily go the route of bicameralism. Some, like Israel, have one chamber. The Knesset, for example, is unicameral. And arguments could be made for unicameralism, that it's much more efficient, that it's simpler, that it's easier to streamline policy, as opposed to the bicameral system where if the House of Representatives and Senate are controlled by two different political parties, you would get gridlock, as we have seen in the past. On the other hand, maybe a very super efficient government might not be ideal. Might that put too much power in the hands of one political party or faction? Other ways to categorize legislatures might be using these two categories here, the Westminster system, which is popular in the UK, and the presidential system, which is used by the United States of America. In the presidential system, you have a legislature that is elected independent of the executive branch, which is elected indirectly by the people, but in a separate election. On the other hand, if you look at the Westminster system, the executive comes directly out of the legislature. Theresa May, who was on the first page of this presentation, is not just the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, she is also the leader of the majority party in the lower chamber of the British government. Think about that for a minute. If her party is disciplined, she can pretty much dictate a policy, the party will pass it, and then as the executive, she would enforce that. Doesn't that sound possibly a little quasi-dictatorial? Of course, it's not a complete dictatorship because we do need to remember that even in the Westminster system, the members of the House of Commons are elected. If you look over at the presidential system, there is almost a guarantee of a balance of power, of checks, of a president not getting everything that he or she wants, because the Congress is almost designed for the possibility of being controlled by a different party or different faction. In the United States of America, we are heading into the midterm elections where the president is not on the ballot, but several members of the House and Senate are. It is quite possible to have, and almost very probable to have, a Congress that will be controlled, maybe one chamber, maybe both, by one party, and an executive branch that will be controlled by the other party. Now, someone in the Westminster system might say, well, that doesn't really guarantee a lot of cooperation. On the other hand, someone in the presidential system might look over at the Westminster system and say, well, maybe that's too much power being concentrated in one executive. There are pros and cons of each, and I hope as you explore this chapter you consider the pros and cons of each. Now let's look at some of the legislatures and their partisan composition. We'll start with our own, the American legislature. You have, of course, the House of Representatives and the United States Senate. Now, simple majority is all that's needed to control each chamber, and as you can see, one of the two major political parties easily has simple majority. There isn't much when it comes to third or independent political parties. Even in the United States Senate, where two independents do hold office, for the purposes of organization, they do caucus with the Democrats. Many Americans have voiced frustration with the two-party duopoly in the American legislature and in the American government overall. But let's really consider whether this is so bad of an idea, whether the two-party duopoly is so bad to have, and entertain the question of whether the United States should switch over to a multi-party system. Let's look at the British legislature, the British Parliament. I'm only showing the House of Commons right now because it really is the only substantive chamber of the British legislature. There is an upper chamber, it's known as the House of Lords. However, it has but one substantive power, and that is to delay legislation. So really the focus of the political power in the British legislature is the House of Commons. And that leads me to revisit the whole bicameral, unicameral point I made earlier. Some bicameral systems of legislature are not equal. In some, indeed many, democratic republics that practice bicameralism, one chamber is the more powerful of the two. So let's look at the House of Commons. There are 650 seats. A simple majority would be 326 seats. If you look at the last election in the British Parliament gave the Conservative Party, Theresa May's party, 316 seats, not enough to have a majority. However, her rivals, the Labour Party, that's the mainstream left-wing party, only garnered 258 seats as a result. What happens here for the government to actually form is a coalition. The Conservative Party aligned with the Democratic Union Party, which gave a coalition 326 seats, enough for Theresa May to have a majority. But let's think of this for a moment. Those 10 members of the Democratic Union Party, a small party that would otherwise be inconsequential, are part of what holds this coalition together. So the Democratic Union Party can make significant demands of the conservative-led government under Theresa May. Even though they are the much smaller junior partner of this coalition, they do wield a considerable degree of political power. Even if you think about how powerful the Prime Minister is, as I mentioned earlier, there is a limit to that power because that power is contingent on this coalition staying together. The moment the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom does something that the Democratic Union Party does not like, they can threaten to pull out of the coalition, and that would cause the British Parliament to dissolve. You would have to have new elections. That's something else that makes the Westminster system unique. Whereas in the presidential system, elections tend to be scheduled, right? We have elections for Congress every 2 years. The British Parliament serves a 5-year term. However, if it's a coalition and the coalition collapses before those 5 years, a new election is called for. The Prime Minister also can dissolve the British Parliament, and in times past has done exactly that. In fact, the British Parliament that we're looking at right now came as a result of the Prime Minister's decision to dissolve Parliament in 2017. What Prime Minister May might not have foreseen was that the British electorate elected a parliament that weakened her party's majority and compelled her to form a coalition, in this case with the Democratic Union Party. Or rather, Democratic Unionist Party. That is the correct name of that political party. An otherwise small party based in Northern Ireland. Coalitions sometimes are formed to deliberately keep those smaller parties out of the political process. Consider the German parliament in 2018. You have your mainstream right-wing parties, the Christian Democrats and the Christian Social Union, that formed a coalition with their principal rivals, the Social Democrats to form what's known as a grand coalition of the center in order to keep out the more ideologically more partisan third and minor parties, like the Alternative for Germany, which is your right-wing nationalist party, and the party known as the Left, which is, well, as the name implies, a political party that's much further to the left relative to the Social Democrats. The Social Democrats absolutely did not want to form a coalition with the left. Better to form a coalition with the mainstream right-wing party. And so that's what you have in Germany right now, a coalition of the center. And here's a question to ponder, and this is what we're going to close this presentation with eventually. What would the United States look like in a multi-party system with multiple parties on the right, on the political right, on the political left getting elected? Would the Republicans and Democrats come together and form a centrist coalition to keep all the third parties out of the political process? I also want to stress that even in republics where there is multiple party competition, that doesn't necessarily mean every party gets a good chunk of seats. In Russia, contemporary Russia, also known as the Russian Federation, one political party dominates. 226 seats are needed to control the Duma, and United Russia, the party that supports President Putin, clearly meets that mark and then some. In fact, they have a coalition partner in the Liberal Democratic Party, which usually supports the policies of United Russia, but they don't even need that coalition partner. And I'll take this moment to point out that opposition parties, even though they don't have a direct hand in the governing and the shaping of policies, still do have a responsibility in a democratic society to provide alternative policies in the event that they one day do gain control of the parliament, although Russia is probably not the best example for a democratic republic given the increasingly powerful role of the executive branch in the Russian government. Let's also look at one of the youngest democracies, South Africa, and even here you can see the ANC, officially known as the African National Congress, that is the political party of Nelson Mandela, pretty much dominates the parliament. Only 201 seats would be needed to have a majority, and the ANC clearly has that and more. The mainstream rival to the ANC, the Democratic Alliance, doesn't even come close with 89 seats. However, again, an opposition party still has the responsibility in a democratic republic to provide alternative policy, to provide questions to the party in power doing the governing. Just as United Russia dominates Russia and the ANC dominates South Africa, in Japan you also see, and have seen over time, the Liberal Democratic Party pretty much dominates Japanese politics. However, there was a brief period in Japanese history where 8 other political parties formed a coalition, and that coalition was able to hit majority of the Japanese parliament, the Diet. This coalition was short-lived because the 8 political parties could not agree on much other than their opposition to the Liberal Democratic Party of Japan. Still, it should serve as evidence that even in systems where one party dominates, that domination is not absolute, especially when democratic elections are held. So let's pose the question, what would the United States of America look like in a multi-party system? The Economist actually did play with this idea, and here's what they came up with. 5 hypothetical political parties across the political spectrum. About a quarter of the United States would vote for a Democratic Socialist Party, similar to the policies of Bernie Sanders. You would find about a quarter of the American public would support the populist party policies of Donald Trump. You might call that the Populist Party or the People's Party. A little more than a quarter of Americans would be your mainstream left-wing party. That would be the Democrats, following the policies of Hillary Clinton. We call them the Liberal Party. You would have a smaller center-right party known as the Conservative Party, and they've named John Kasich as a hypothetical leader of that party, the governor of Ohio who refused to support President Trump, and 11% of Americans would form a religious-based right-wing party. The hypothetical name would be the Christian Coalition, and they would support the policies, the socially conservative policies of Ted Cruz. So now it's your turn. Do you agree that the United States, if it had a multi-party parliamentary system, would have results similar to this, what the economists predicted? And what coalition would form? The two left-wing parties would have more than enough seats in a hypothetical parliament to form a government, but we know that the left-wing of Bernie Sanders type political participants and the more center-left Clinton type of political participants do not necessarily agree, don't even necessarily get along. After all, they would be distinct political parties. Maybe, on the other hand, you would find a coalition of the populist party of Donald Trump aligning with the Christian coalition of Ted Cruz and the center-right coalition of John Kasich, along with maybe a chunk of independents or some from the center-left to form a coalition there. Perhaps the three hypothetical political parties right in the middle would form a centrist coalition to keep the populist-style folks along the lines of President Trump out, and the socialists along the line of Senator Sanders out of control of the legislature. Or, and this is not entirely unfounded, although probably still far-fetched, the populist People's Party of Donald Trump and the left-wing socialist Democrats could form a coalition themselves. Because we know that in areas of trade and protectionism, that the policies of Donald Trump do align with the policies of Bernie Sanders. So take a stab at this. Would the United States, if the United States had a parliamentary system of government, what would it look like? Would it look like this? Would it look different? Just considering this, would you like to see the United States have a multi-party parliamentary system? Or does the two-party duopoly look much more favorable now? I look forward to hearing your feedback in the comments section of our discussion forum.